The morning of Thursday, September 14th, 1978, in San Juan de los Lagos, Jalisco, began like so many others. The milky sky, the heat just waking up, and a dense silence broken only by the distant buzz of a malfunctioning fan. At 7:15, Ramon Herrera Hernandez, a 36-year-old mechanic, a reserved and meticulous man, locked his small workshop in the El Rosario neighborhood with a rusty padlock. He wore his faded blue shirt, stained with oil, the same one he had been wearing for weeks, and carried a tin lunchbox scratched with remnants of red paint. He told his neighbor, with little intention of chatting, that he was running an urgent errand in Lagos de Moreno and would return by nightfall. That was the last time anyone saw him alive. Ramon had a reputation for being serious but reliable. He didn't drink, didn't go out, and didn't speak unnecessarily. His world was his workshop, his 1973 Chevrolet C10 truck, and the engines. He dismantled as if he were taking apart clocks. That Thursday, however, something about the way he looked was different. He avoided the baker's gaze, walked faster, and started the engine with a clumsiness that was unlike him. His disappearance was noticed that same night when his mother, a thin woman with cracked hands and devotion to the Virgin of San Juan, walked to the workshop when he hadn't returned. The truck was gone. The gate was still locked with its own padlock, but inside the lights remained on. On the workbench, a cold enamel cup of coffee and an unsent letter. It read in trembling handwriting and smeared ink, "The only thing that hurts me is the silence." During the first 48 hours, the local police assumed it was a voluntary disappearance or a minor settlement of accounts. There was no formal complaint, not until the following Monday. The initial case was filed under the category of a missing person. His mother, through tears, swore that Ramon would never have left his workshop, neither for money nor fear. What no one knew at that moment was that beneath the dry earth of an abandoned ravine, a few kilometers from Lagos de Moreno, the key to a story that would take 3 decades to emerge lay in silence. In the first few days, Ramon Herrera Hernandez's disappearance was a constant murmur among the neighbors of San Juan de los Lagos. No one understood why such a reserved and methodical man, with such a predictable life, could simply vanish. His mother, Dona Ernestina, walked the streets with a framed photo in her hands, visiting police stations, parishes, and gas stations. Every night, she left a lit candle in front of the workshop and prayed softly, as if those prayers could travel across fields, mountains, and miles of silence. The local police acted without enthusiasm. In their initial report, they noted that the disappearance could be related to an unsettled debt or a romantic conflict. No signs of violence, one of. At first, reports read. In reality, there were no signs of anything. His truck never appeared. His wallet was never used. His signature didn't appear on any transaction. A dry blotch, as if he had been surgically ripped out of reality, by December of that same year. The search had dwindled to the desperate effort of his mother and Rogelio, his young apprentice, who pasted posters in nearby towns with the mechanic's black and white image. The truck, a 1973 red Chevrolet C10, was considered a key piece, but no one saw it. Vague theories were floated. He had run off with someone else's money, had witnessed something improper, or had been mistaken for someone else. None of them advanced. In 1981, a man with a northern accent called from a public phone in Aguascalientes, claiming to have seen Ramon in a seedy pension. When the police arrived, they found a confused alcoholic without identification. In 1991, a retired traffic officer claimed to have stopped an identical truck in the 70s, but the records were incomplete and the lead was lost. In 1999, an anonymous tip claimed that the truck was being used with false plates into Patadlan. A patrol was sent. They found a burned vehicle in a ravine, but the serial number had been scratched off. Again, nothing conclusive. Over the years, a case became a shadow. New police officers didn't even know how to pronounce the full name of the missing person. The workshop was closed, boarded up, and then demolished to build a chain pharmacy. Rogelio moved to Leon and never spoke of the matter again. Donna Ernestina died in 2003 in her bed, with a candle lit beside her and her son's photo pinned to the wall with a tack. She never knew anything. On her grave, someone wrote in chalk, "He didn't leave. They swallowed him." No one erased that inscription. San Juan de los Lagos grew, but Raymond's case was left behind, like so many other stories of men who disappear on secondary roads. The file was transferred to a judicial warehouse in Tepic and gathered dust for 3 decades. But the silence was not forgotten dot under the earth. Something awaited. It was in September 2008, after a particularly severe storm in the Lagos de Moreno region, when everything changed. The rains washed away a portion of dry earth on an unnamed rural road, creating a trench several meters long. At the bottom, rusted and covered with roots, a metallic fragment with recognizable curved lines appeared. A farmer looking for firewood saw it glimmering in the mud and alerted the police. It was the rear end of an old truck, half buried, with the paint worn away by the years. No one knew yet, but time had begun to unearth the truth. On Monday, September 22, 2008, on a dusty path crossing between the borders of Ejido El Platner and the dry fields of La Estrella, Tomas Lerma, a 63-year-old farmer, was walking with his machete over his shoulder, searching for dry branches for firewood. After the previous week's rains, several roads in the area had been blocked by mudslides. It was then that, as he approached an eroded ravine from the storm, he noticed a metallic gleam among the exposed roots and wet soil. At first, he thought it was an old tire or the side of an oxidized trailer. But when he cleared the brush with his machete, he revealed what seemed to be the top corner of a truck, its paint completely gone from rust and its hood sunken under a broken rock. The discovery, silent and opaque as a whisper swallowed by the earth, unsettled Tomas. Without touching anything else, he returned to the village and notified the Lagos de Moreno police. The next day, Tuesday morning, 2 state agents and a forensic expert arrived with shovels, yellow tape, and portable flashlights. After more than 3 hours of manual excavation, a partially buried vehicle emerged, a Chevrolet C10 truck, an older model, visibly damaged, with no tires, no windows, and a collapsed rear bumper. Inside, there were debris, branches, and compacted dirt, but the chassis and part of the structure still retained the distinctive lines of the 1970s design. There were no visible plates, but the serial number engraved on the inner edge of the CN. Driver's side chassis was still partially legible. After carefully cleaning the corroded metal and photographing it, the forensic expert compared the digits with the state database of vintage vehicles. That's when a file, archived decades ago, surfaced. The truck matched the one reported missing in 1978, associated with a forgotten name, Ramon Herrera Hernandez. The case, inactive for more than 30 years, had lain dormant under layers of avires. Institutional indifference. No one at the regional prosecutor's office remembered this Ramon. The truck was removed with a crane at noon. When it was moved, the displaced earth revealed the driver's door and part of the vehicle's floor. The interior, destroyed by humidity, smelled of rancid metal, rotting rubber, and confinement. There was no trace of the original seats or steering wheel, but under the surprisingly intact rear seat, one of the agents found an improvised compartment. It was a rectangular cavity covered by a metal sheet, riveted and sealed with hardened tar. Upon carefully opening it, they found several stacks of bills. They were old pesos from the 1970s, with the image of Miguel Hidalgo printed on thick paper. They were damp, stained with mold, stuck together by time. Some almost disintegrated. The total could not be counted at that moment, but the experts estimated that there were originally several million. The money, evidently hidden, could not have been there by accident. It was money concealed, preserved, meant to remain hidden. For a long time, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. One of the agents suggested searching the rest of the vehicle before moving it. That's when they noticed that the rear floor of the chassis had a sheet of metal welded in, different from the rest, with marks of improvised welding. The forensic expert recommended not handling it at the site. The truck was secured and sent to the Forensic Medical Service in Guadalajara with armed custody and a preservation order. The case was assigned to the Property Crimes Prosecutor's Office. The news barely leaked to the local press. The newspaper La Region published a brief note: buried truck with old money found in a ravine in Jalisco. However, that single line was enough to reach the ears of Rogelio, Raymond's former apprentice, who still lived in Leon. Upon seeing the archival photo in the article, he recognized the dent on the left side of the rear bumper. He decided to present himself to the prosecutor's office. With a trembling voice, he said, "That was Master Raymond's truck. No one else had one like it." 3 days after the discovery, on September 25, 2008, the truck was inspected in a closed warehouse of the Forensic Medical Service in Guadalajara. The procedure was led by Prosecutor Leticia Munoz, with the presence of 2 forensic experts, a criminologist and a physical anthropologist. The focus was no longer just on the deteriorated money, of which more than 800 bills, partially legible, had been recovered, but also on the mysterious metal sheet welded to the bottom of the chassis. It was a metal plate with no screws, fixed, with irregular welding, as if someone had hastily or fearfully created a hiding place. With specialized tools and cameras recording every angle, the technicians began cutting through the metal plate. The smell that emerged was overwhelming, acidic, unmistakable, a mixture of rust, confinement, and aged decomposition. After completely removing the cover, they found what appeared to be a rectangular cavity about 70 centimeters deep. Inside, wrapped in deteriorated black plastic bags, lay incomplete human remains. First, long bones were visible, then fabric fragments, and deeper inside, a skull in a lateral position with the jaw displaced. The fabric, disintegrated by time, still retained traces of a blue shirt, a small aluminum identification tag hanging from an oxidized cord read R. Herrera H. There was no doubt for the prosecutor. They were the remains of the mechanic who had disappeared 30 years ago. The autopsy was complicated due to the advanced state of decomposition and prolonged exposure to the closed environment. However, preliminary anthropological analysis established a match in age, build, and height with Ramon Herrera Hernandez. Additionally, bone samples were extracted for mitochondrial DNA analysis, which would be compared to preserved tissues from his mother, still available from an old sample taken at the civil hospital during her last hospitalization in 2003. The revelation shocked the investigators. This was no longer just a disappearance or hidden money from smugglers. There was a body, a name, and a carefully silenced crime. The compartment where the body was found seemed to have been designed to remain invisible for years. Meanwhile, the experts analyzed the bills. More than 40 stacks still held fragments of fingerprints, though very degraded. Some were printed on security paper used between 1973 and 1975, reinforcing the theory that the money had been gathered during that decade. One of the stacks, bound with a completely fossilized blue rubber band, had a barely visible inscription. On one of the edges, RDC 878. This acronym triggered an old suspicion. During the initial investigations in the 1970s, There had been unconfirmed rumors that Ramon was linked to a money laundering group using mechanic workshops in the Los Altos region. One of the names that appeared in those anonymous reports was that of then Commander Rodolfo del Cid, head of the traffic department in Lagos de Moreno in 1978. Although he was never formally investigated, his name appeared in a couple of citizen complaints involving bribes, covert disappearances, and favors to local drug traffickers. Munoz immediately requested access to the historical file of the State Public Security Directorate. The file on Del Cid was incomplete, partially burned during a flood in 1994. Still, one key document survived, a typewritten page listing confiscated vehicles between July and September of 1978. Among them was a Chevrolet C10. Without plates, without an identified driver, detained for 4 days and released without a file or responsible signature. This piece of information changed the course of the investigation. The vehicle had not only been located in 1978, but it had also been in the hands of the authorities, albeit briefly. Who ordered its release? Why was it not linked to Raymond's disappearance at the time? Why was no one informed of that discovery? Prosecutor Munoz's team decided to reconstruct the movement of the vehicle during that month. According to emerging clues, the truck did not disappear completely. It had been retained, manipulated, and then deliberately hidden. A systematic cover-up seemed to have been set in motion. The question was, who and why? On September 27th, prosecutor Leticia Munoz called for a discreet press conference without cameras or sensational headlines. The case was too old, too delicate. By this point, it was no longer just about clarifying a disappearance. What was coming to light was a structure of institutional complicity that had, at the time, allowed Ramon Herrera to disappear without a trace and his body to be deliberately hidden inside a vehicle that had also been retained and released by the local police without any justification. The working hypothesis began to take shape. Ramon had not been the victim of a crime of passion or a confusion. He had been eliminated because he knew too much. Some documents recovered from the judicial archive indicated that his workshop, although modest, was being used by third parties to modify vehicles that were later smuggled into Zacatecas and Aguascalientes, loaded with illicit money. Ramon, probably unaware at first, had been a technical accomplice. But something changed in August 1978. A letter written by his own mother, kept in a parish notebook, mentioned that the young man seemed nervous, as if something heavy weighed on his conscience. The investigators soon confirmed that Rodolfo del Cid, the former commander linked to the vehicle, had died in 2001 in a car accident on his way to San Luis Potosi. Although he had never been formally charged or even investigated, several sources pointed to him as an intermediary between corrupt security personnel and emerging criminal groups during the latter half of the 70s. With his death, many answers were lost. However, the testimony of Rogelio, Raymond's former apprentice, provided a new lead. He claimed that weeks before his disappearance, Ramon had confessed to him that he was thinking of closing the workshop. He told me he didn't like the people who came, that they smelled of death and wanted silence. From that statement, the prosecutors began to study Ramon's immediate surroundings. The name that emerged was Ruben Artiga, alias El Tapatio, a well-known intermediary in the area for moving goods without a trace. Artiga had been arrested in 1984 for tax evasion, but was released due to lack of evidence. He died in 1992 of natural causes. Although Artiga and Del Cid could no longer be interrogated, their names constantly appeared together in records. Both frequented the same bars, shared certain properties under front names, and had ties to other unresolved cases from the time. The pattern was repetitive: disappearances, manipulated vehicles, police silence, and prosecutors who archived cases. During the final inspection of the truck, a revealing detail was found. Beneath the deteriorated upholstery of the right door panel was a small oxidized metal cross, tied with wire and wrapped in a scrap of fabric with the initials A hand-stitched. Dona Ernestina Herrera had almost certainly placed it there, perhaps at a time when she helped her son in the workshop. This relic was handed over to Rogelio, who silently wept when he received it. His mother hung that for him. She always told him not to go out without it. The case, although seemingly resolved, left more questions than certainties. The motive pointed to a silent execution to protect a money laundering network in which Ramon had, apparently, stopped wanting to participate. His death was then a warning, and the burial of the truck, a symbol of power and silence. The prosecutor's office issued an official statement closing the case based on the forensic findings, recognizing Ramon Herrera as a victim of homicide, and requesting that the State Historical Memory Commission place a plaque where his workshop once stood, now converted into a bank branch. The request was approved. At the small placement ceremony, no surviving family members were present. Only Rogelio, in a wrinkled suit, remained silent in front of the freshly painted wall. It read in bronze letters, "Here worked Ramon Herrera Hernandez. Disappeared in 1978. Found 30 years later." The silence did not erase him. Following the discovery of Ramon Herrera's remains and the buried Chevrolet C10 truck, the Jalisco prosecutor's office initiated a parallel investigation, reopening the original case, but focusing not on clarifying a disappearance, but on unraveling the possible existence of a structured network of complicity between authorities, police forces, and operators of economic crime during the second half of the 70s. Prosecutor Leticia Munoz formed a special multidisciplinary team that included criminologists, historical archive specialists, forensic anthropologists, and 2 assistant prosecutors. The goal was to reconstruct step by step what had happened to Ramon from the last day. He was seen alive until the moment his body ended up hidden in the chassis compartment. One of the first steps was to return to the original file, the one that had been archived in 1978 with the label Missing Person. That file, consisting of only 12 typewritten pages, included his mother's complaint, a couple of contradictory neighborhood statements, and a police report with no signature. Beyond that, everything else was omitted. The workshop was never investigated, the young apprentice was never interviewed, and the journey to Lagos de Moreno was never traced. For Leticia Munoz, the fact that no vehicle location order was ever issued was the first major sign of negligence or cover-up. Rogelio, the apprentice, was formally questioned under oath. He stated that during the week leading up to his master's disappearance, 2 men in gray suits had come to the workshop to demand something. Ramon, he recalled, went with them to the back alley and returned pale with trembling hands. That same night, Rogelio heard him murmur while closing the shop, "I don't want to be in this anymore." No one asked him anything in 1978. The prosecutor's office obtained judicial permission to inspect the land where the workshop had once stood. The structure had been demolished in the 90s, but the original blueprints of the property were still available. Under the concrete slab, which now supported a pharmaceutical warehouse, 3 underground storage compartments were discovered, possibly used to store parts or tools. One of them, unusually large, contained remnants of old tools wrapped in hardened rags, a broken wooden box with smudged inscriptions reading Pro I 78, and an oxidized canister that still contained traces of industrial solvent. But the most disturbing discovery was not physical but documentary. In the General Archive of the State, an employee named Edgar Villaserer found a loose sheet inside a folder labeled Authorized Workshops, 19,779. The paper, signed by Rodolfo del Cid and dated August 1978, authorized the administrative inspection of the Herrera Servomotor Workshop due to alleged activities unrelated to its registered business. There was no record of the inspection being carried out. However, the same sheet carried the signature of a person named R. Artiga, identifiable as Ruben Artiga, the alleged intermediary for illicit money. The prosecutor's team then formulated a hypothesis. Ramon Herrera had been forced to modify or hide vehicles connected to money laundering operations. When he tried to back out of the scheme or showed signs of regret, he was eliminated. His truck, an ordinary vehicle without visible plates or any external modifications, was chosen as his coffin. Hiding it wasn't just about making Ramon disappear. It was about erasing the existence of betrayal and disobedience. To support this hypothesis, more than just deductions were needed. A decision was made to exhume Rodolfo del Cid's body, who had died in 2001, in order to obtain a genetic sample that could be compared with partial fingerprints found on some of the hidden stacks of bills. The order was authorized by a district judge. During the exhumation at the Jardines del Recuerdo cemetery, it was discovered that his tomb had been tampered with. The coffin did not match the registered model, and the inner box showed signs of having been replaced. The body, although preserved, was missing its hands. For Prosecutor Munoz, this was no longer just a case of impunity. It was an organized plot to destroy evidence. News of the exhumation did not leak to the media, but within the prosecuting team, it caused a silent shock. The fact that the body was missing its hands, that the original box had been replaced, and that there was no formal record of the change in the cemetery's records, raised an institutional alert. Someone had intervened in the corpse years after its burial. Who would have had access? With what purpose? What trace was being erased? The death certificate stated that Del Cid died on August 17, 2001, as the result of a car accident while driving at dawn on the road to San Luis Potosi. The vehicle, according to the forensic report at the time, had swerved off the road and crashed into a tree. There were no witnesses or recordings. The body was transferred directly to a private funeral home and buried the next day. The funeral home consulted in 2008 had changed ownership. The intake file had been lost. One more line of disappearance within another. Leticia Munoz requested a review of Del Cid's family background. His only daughter, who resided in Querétaro, refused to testify. However, a former housemaid provided an unsettling detail. In 2004, 3 years after the ex-commander's death, a group of men dressed in dark suits went to the cemetery, accompanied by a government lawyer to carry out a review for legal reasons. The woman did not remember the names, but she did remember the time. It was at dawn, in secret. This intervention was not recorded in any official database. Meanwhile, the forensic laboratory managed to recover a partial fingerprint from one of Yvonne. The plastic bands with which the stacks of bills had been tied inside the truck. The fingerprint, although incomplete, showed patterns matching old records of police personnel. It wasn't possible to determine the identity with certainty, but the matching algorithm returned as its top result: Del Cid Rodolfo. Legally insufficient. Narratively devastating, the authorities began to assemble a broader file one of omissions, cover-ups, and manipulations that seemed to have operated with total impunity in the northern Altos region of Jalisco for at least 5 years. Ramon Herrera, a small-town mechanic, had been a minor piece in a larger machinery, but his refusal or simple discomfort had made him a target. It wasn't necessary for him to speak, just for him to have doubts. Rogelio's testimony became even more significant as he remembered that 2 days before his master's disappearance, Ramon had been visited by a man they called the engineer. He never knew his real name. He wore a white Guayabera, drove a green Volkswagen Beetle, and asked about the Tuesday order. Ramon responded evasively. That same night, he said he was considering closing the shop. The engineer never returned, but the nickname was traced by Munoz's team in several files. He was linked in 1977 to a case of illicit enrichment against traffic officers. His name, Gerardo Esquivias Najera, was that of a former technical officer in the Jalisco Department of Transportation. He had died in 1995, but his properties were still active under third parties' names. A farm in Encarnacion de Diaz, registered under a shell company, was raided by judicial order on October 9th. In one of its basements, destroyed files, remnants of vehicle parts, and even a complete set of 1970s vehicle plates, many with altered numbers, were found. The raid also yielded a dusty notebook inside an oxidized safe. On the cover, it read Ram Hal 0978. The initials seemed to match Ramon and Jalisco, and the date reinforced the timeline. Inside were numbers, names, routes. Many were crossed out. One note said, "The one with the engine doesn't want to. Says he's not going to run anymore for anyone. Fix before the 15th. Ramon disappeared on the 14th. The chronology was narrowing. The clues were no longer just assumptions. There was a pattern of coercion, subtle warnings, and forced silences. Fixing seemed, in this context, not to refer to any mechanical repair. That discovery triggered a review of similar cases in the area between 1976 and 1980. At least 5 disappearances of small business. Owners had gone unresolved. A blacksmith, a tire dealer, a freight truck driver, an upholsterer, and a taxi driver. All had had contacts with vehicles, routes, and modifications. All disappeared without a trace. None were thoroughly investigated. In each of these cases, as in Ramon's, there was a consistent administrative silence, police omissions, and families that never received answers. The cumulative impact of the findings forced the state prosecutor's office to accept that what was coming to light was not an isolated case, but part of a network of dark operations that had been ongoing for years with institutional cover. Ramon Herrera Hernandez's figure, in this context, took on an unexpected symbolic weight, not only as a victim, but as a silenced witness of a system that preferred to erase anyone who doubted rather than face the risk of being exposed. Prosecutor Leticia Munoz ordered the centralization of all files related to the disappearances of independent workers between 1975 and 1980. In an attempt to form a more complete map, one of the most revealing documents emerged from the dead. File of the now-defunct Guadalajara Vehicle Inspection Department. A letter dated August 29, 1978, signed by Gerardo Esquivias Najera, the now-deceased engineer, authorized the issuance of 5 sets of temporary plates for field vehicle inspection projects. One of those alphanumeric combinations partially matched the sequence found in the buried truck. This was a clear sign that Raymond's vehicle had been used as a cover for illegal activities, possibly after his death. At the same time, interviews with retired former officials were reopened. One of them, Salvador Paniaga, a former sector chief. In Tepatitlán, now 82 years old and in a wheelchair, agreed to meet with the prosecutor's team at his home. During the conversation, he confessed that in 1978, he had received direct orders not to intervene in cases related to mechanics. That ambiguous phrase seemed to refer to some informal code to reference workshops involved in special operations. One stayed quiet young. Back then, the one who asked too many questions didn't last, he said, holding an old notebook in which he marked with a trembling hand an X next to the names of colleagues who, like him, had been forced to look the other way. This network of institutional silence, built through fear, convenience, or direct complicity, made it possible for Raymond's case to remain buried for 30 years. No one signed the inspection of his workshop. No one reported the retention of his truck. No one investigated the register of the old bills. Everything seemed to have been carefully erased, but not everything could be wiped out. In the final forensic reconstruction of the case, experts managed to determine the exact position of Raymond's body inside the chassis compartment. The body had been placed in a fetal position, with arms crossed over the chest and the head tilted to the right side. This position was not casual. It indicated that he had been forcefully placed with violence, but also with an intimate knowledge of the vehicle. It was highly likely that whoever hit him knew exactly which parts to dismantle, how to distribute the weight to prevent the vehicle from betraying its load, and how to cover it to withstand years of humidity without collapsing. The body showed old fractures consistent with a fall or blunt force trauma. There were no gunshot wounds. The final report concluded the cause of death as severe cranioencephalic trauma with untreated internal bleeding. The blow, according to estimates, occurred between 8 and 12 hours before the concealment, meaning Ramon likely agonized before dying alone, in silence. The only belonging found with him was an oxidized St. Benedict medal hanging from a hemp string around his neck. The medal was returned to Rogelio, the only living person with direct ties. He held it between his fingers for several minutes before placing it in the inner pocket of his jacket. He wore it every day. He said it protected him, but there are things even saints can't protect against. Meanwhile, the State Human Rights Commission issued an extraordinary statement, recognizing institutional responsibility for gross omission in the disappearance and cover-up of the case. It was the first time in recent history in Jalisco that a forgotten victim from the 1970s was officially recognized as such. The media, which at first had barely paid attention to the truck's discovery, began to cover each development with more interest. Local television programs interviewed historians, lawyers, and specialists in past crimes. For the first time in decades, there was talk of the possibility of reopening dozens of forgotten cases. Ramon, unwittingly, had become a symbol of what happens when a single man refuses to keep pretending. The last stage of the investigation coincided with increasing media pressure and strong institutional resistance. Not everyone within the state apparatus was comfortable with the conclusions that Leticia Munoz's team was reaching. Some files began to mysteriously disappear. Others, like the records of seized vehicles between August and September of 1978, were delivered with pages torn out or illegible. However, the prosecutor did not stop. She turned to old copies preserved by civil associations, notes from local newspapers, and interviews with retired officials, carefully weaving them into an indisputable chronology. The final report, spanning more than 600 pages, detailed precisely how the network operated. Small workshops were used as transit points for vehicles loaded with money, weapons, or messages. In most cases, the mechanics were not members of organized crime, but functional pieces coerced by fear, money, and oppression. Whenever one strayed from the line, like Ramon, mechanisms of neutralization, disappearance, intimidation, or even murder were activated. The most chilling part was that all of this occurred with the passive or direct participation of traffic police officers, municipal officials, and in some cases, subordinate prosecutors. One figure emerged strongly among the documents: Manuel El Tuerto Gudico, head of vehicle inspections between 1976 and 1981, who had been named in at least 3 citizen complaints for illicit enrichment. In the files, there was a sheet with a list of names and dates. Ramon Herrera's name appeared next to 3 other missing persons: the blacksmith from Encarnacion de Diaz, the upholsterer from Tepatitlan, and a truck driver named Hilario Diaz, last seen in Arandas. The list was titled a mano, cinco. Gudico was located living in Mazatlan, retired and removed from any public office for over 2 decades. When summoned to testify, he sought legal protection. He didn't deny knowing Del Cid or Esquives Najera, but he claimed not to remember any details, names, or vehicles. The prosecutor's office lacked sufficient evidence to formally charge him, but his name was recorded in the report delivered to the National Search Commission as a key actor in the context of Raymond's disappearance. At the same time, the forensic anthropology team reconstructed a three-dimensional model of the compartment where the body was found. Using digital prints and scans of the chassis, they were able to demonstrate that the cavity had been purposefully constructed with industrial tools. It wasn't an improvisation. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. The vehicle had been modified to transport the body without the weight affecting its normal functioning. There were no signs of fluid leaks or traces on the exterior. Everything had been designed to disappear without raising suspicion. A new crucial piece emerged. In the last days of the investigation, a photograph, anonymously sent to the prosecutor's office physical mailbox, showed Raymond's workshop taken from the street in 1978. The image depicted his truck parked outside, and beside it, a man in a traffic officer uniform leaning on the bumper. The photo was wrinkled, worn, but the face of the person was recognizable. It was Rodolfo Del Cid. The photograph was authenticated by an expert. There was no doubt. Del Cid had been at the workshop the same month as Raymond's disappearance. This evidence not only reinforced his direct involvement, but completely contradicted his supposed ignorance of the case, as had always been stated in official reports. The submission of the final report to the State Memory Commission, Leticia Munoz closed the investigative phase. She knew there would be no arrests, that many of the guilty parties were already dead, that the survivors had learned to hide behind legal protection, omissions, and legal loopholes. But she also knew that the truth, as fragmented as it was, had emerged from the earth, from the rust, from the decay of a vehicle buried for 3 decades. The workshop where it all began, now converted into a pharmaceutical distribution center, was secretly visited by Rogelio days before the commemorative plaque was placed. He walked up to the gate, placed his hand on the cold metal, and whispered a prayer. He didn't ask for justice, just murmured the name of his mentor, as if by naming him something could return for a brief moment. What was being closed wasn't a file. It was an old wound, a memory that refused to die. 20 days after beginning one of the most delicate investigations in recent history in Jalisco, Ramon Herrera Hernandez's case was officially closed, not for lack of evidence, but for lack of living culprits. There were no prosecutions, no hearings, no sentences, but there was a public acknowledgement, an institutional admission of guilt, and above all, a truth recovered that had been buried for 30 years under earth, rust, and silence. The plaque was placed on Monday, October 20th, under a gray sky. The ceremony was brief, sober, without cameras or political speeches. Rogelio, in a simple suit, stood in front of the white wall of the former workshop. In one hand, he held the oxidized St. Benedict medal, in the other, a white carnation. Prosecutor Leticia Munoz, discreetly present, observed from a distance. There was no band or ribbon cutting, just a quiet reading of the words engraved in bronze. Here worked Ramon Herrera Hernandez. Disappeared in 1978, found 30 years later. Silence did not erase him. In San Juan de los Lagos, some elderly people still remembered the quiet man with firm hands who fixed engines without looking at the clock. But for the new generations, Ramon was now a story told in schools, in the media, in talks about the past the country is trying to repair. A story where the crime was not just to kill, but to make sure no one asked questions. The final report of the case was incorporated into the State Unresolved Crimes Archive. In it, a phrase closes the last paragraph with words that seek not consolation, but memory. Not all the disappeared were silenced by death. Some spoke from the earth. Rogelio, when leaving, placed the flower at the base of the wall and walked away without looking back. He kept the medal not as a symbol of protection, but as a relic of resistance. Because even though justice doesn't always come as expected, the truth, when it finally emerges, carries a weight that no silence can bury.